So yes. So everyone, we are live, and I'm really excited with my friend Peter here because we've talked to Peter before, and he was referred by a couple of interesting people. And so I love Peter because, as I just told him, I probably shouldn't say this, but he has. I love talking to him because he makes sense. That's why I love to talk to Peter, and I loved all the people that I talk to. I don't talk to people that don't make sense, but that's again my perception. Peter, how are you today, especially amid the election?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good. It's great to have a bold new future ahead. Um, I'm scared and excited. They're sort of the same thing. We've got sort of 90 days to create the next 4 years.
Yes, and as you said, it's really important. We want to really have what you said. I just want to put it out because I want everybody to know it's your idea. Is to have Biden talking about climate restoration.
Yeah.
When you and I talked some time ago, well, not that long ago, but we talked some time ago. It was really important to me because one of the things I like to focus on is the restoration of the climate, while other people are focusing on global warming. And so you and I come from, just for some people who don't know, we come from something called landmark education, which is transformational teaching.
Yeah.
And since I can sometimes have a very literal and logical mind, I'm not literal, but I can have a logical scientific mind, evidentiary, evidence to show. I really like the fact that you talk about the restoration of climate. I'd like to ask you a question, something that I want people to understand the difference of that you can illuminate.
hmm
And that is, what is the difference between restoring the climate and global warming?
Mm.
People who fight global warming and people who are for restoration of the climate. Neither one is bad at all. They're both helpful. But can you explain the difference?
Yeah. Well, obviously they're sort of the same. And then you ask the question, what's the difference? The difference is, I could say I'm cold, and it's one of those cold days, and I've got the heat on, and I'm a little bit chilly in here. Or you could say, I want to warm up the room. Saying I'm cold leads you to more being cold, and then you discuss it and you argue whose fault it is. Saying let's warm up the room by 3 degrees. I go to the thermostat, I turn it up 3 degrees, and go on with my day. So climate restoration is saying what we want so that we actually just do it. Again, it's like I'm hungry or let's make breakfast. Very different. They sound like the same conversation and they're really very different.
Yeah, so if I were to like really repeat back what you're kind of saying that global warming is something that we are ascribing to end, okay? Where climate restoration is we're looking at actually doing the restoration of the planet.
Yeah. Well, any project starts with a complaint. Um, let's build a house. Well, there was a complaint about I need a place to live, or let's build a road, or let's make breakfast. There was a complaint, started with a complaint, I'm hungry. And so climate restoration starts with a complaint about global warming, that my crops aren't growing so well, there are more diseases and so on. And then if you're a project manager, someone comes to you with a complaint, he says, great. What would it look like for that complaint to be solved? And it takes a little bit of a genius to ask that very simple question. Fortunately, there are billions and millions of geniuses around who ask that question. And in the climate, what I and my group asked the question, okay, we have global warming. What's the outcome we want? What would it look like restored or resolved? And it took me about from 2012 till 2017. So that's 5 years. It took me 5 years of asking that question to realize that resolving the climate requires getting the climate back to the way it was during the evolution of our agriculture and civilization. And that's actually fairly simple. And when you say that, uh, what you want is to get, CO2 is how we got the climate warmer, and removing CO2 is how we're going to cool the planet. And it's it sounds very simple, and once you boil it down, it becomes simple. It's sort of like making breakfast. It actually, it's a lot of actions, and if you've never made breakfast before, it's daunting. I remember when I was 6 and my mom said, "I'm not feeling well, will you make me some breakfast?" And I couldn't. I didn't know how to fry an egg, or where to find the frying pans. And so, but of course, a year later, I'd made breakfast for her a few times, and I always wanted to make breakfast for her. It was easy. Same actions became very, very easy because I had done it, and I knew what the path looked like. Climate restoration is the same, where when you first hear of it, it's like me when I was 5, trying to make breakfast, failing to imagine to make breakfast. But climate restoration means getting the carbon back to levels we had before. And what makes it really easy, again, this is someone who's been thinking about it for 8 years, and it took me 5 years just to figure out that, that's embarrassing. It took me 5 years to figure out that what we really wanted was to get CO2 back to the way it was 100 years ago. It's so obvious now. So that's getting CO2 below 300 parts per million. And to do that, this fairly obvious thing to do is to use the same technique, in a sense, in reverse, that we use to get the carbon into the air. So I think almost all of our listeners know that the way we got carbon into the air is there were companies that sold us products that we wanted, transportation and heat. I like heating my room here, which is now getting warm finally. And they had a byproduct of putting carbon into the air. No one really cared too much, but we did like being able to drive and fly and heat up our houses and run our factories. Well, we've now sort of midway in the transition to clean energy. So solar power and wind power are now, in almost all of the world, less expensive than coal and oil. And in just a few years, it'll be throughout the whole planet, it'll be cheaper. And and so that transition to wind and solar and batteries and hydro and so on, that transition is happening. It can't be stopped. And now what we want is to encourage those industries and products that we like to use, which have byproducts of removing CO2. And so you're probably asking, what products do I use that remove CO2 from the air? And I can come back and give the long story, but the short story is one of them is limestone, which is the way nature has sequestered 99.9% of all the carbon on the planet exists in limestone. And if you imagine the white cliffs of Dover, these beautiful white cliffs, it's all just limestone that was a collection of micro shells, seashells, collected on the bottom of the sea, and over millions and hundreds of millions of years. We have a company, or there's a company here in Silicon Valley called Blue Planet, and they've made a way to make limestone, synthetic limestone. And so you can see, take the top off so you can see, that's too bright. There we go. The synthetic limestone is just like regular limestone, is half CO2 by weight, and it's easy to produce. If you think about oysters producing oyster shells, this is not much more complex than that, but it can be done in a factory. And we use so much rock for our roads and buildings. It's for every man, woman, and child every year, 7 tons. Wow. 7 tons of rock to build our roads and buildings. And so if by replacing the quarried rock with a synthetic limestone made from CO2 from the air, and calcium from various places, but ultimately from the ocean, again, just like nature did to produce the oyster shells and other shells, coccolithophores, if you know biology. And so that's one method. And yeah, the other product is fish, that you can restore ocean fisheries by adding minute amounts of iron dust. So this is again what nature does. Nature occasionally has volcanoes, and the volcanoes spew dust in the ocean, and sometimes there are dust storms. In the spring, you may have heard about this dust storm from the Sahara Desert to the east coast of the US. And the reason the Sahara Desert is pink is there's iron in that rock. And that iron is in much of the ocean, the missing nutrient. And you provide the iron, and then you get a lot of it turns green. It's growing. It's algae. It's phytoplankton.
I was about to ask you, is that what brings the algae in?
Right. The iron is required for photosynthesis. Oh my God, my mind went blank. For the for the chlorophyll. And if you have a garden, often your plants will wilt, and you might take them to the greenhouse, and they'll say, "Oh, you need some iron," because chlorophyll needs iron. Not a lot, a tremendously small amount, but it's got to be there. And if you imagine the middle of the ocean, the only place that iron is going to come from is going to be from dust, either from dust storms or a local volcano.
Wow.
Anyway, yes, so that's what nature does. And there are people developing businesses where they'll spread minute amounts of the iron ore dust.
I have a question for you, Peter, regarding this. So if we can use iron dust, okay, and you tell me if I'm wrong here from what I'm understanding, to restore the fisheries and so forth and bring algae back in, what could we possibly do? What do you see that the average citizen or everyone could do in terms of restoring our coral reefs?
Well, the main thing is to be clear about the outcome you want. Again, it's sort of like if I complain that it's cold in here, I could go get a coat, I could turn the heat up, I could go jumping jacks. You got to be specific about the outcome you want. If someone came in and said I'm cold, I would ignore them because I'm busy. But if they said turn the heat up, I would just turn the heat up. So what people can do is tell our officials and our climate people, our climate leaders, the heads of the Environmental Defense Fund, the head of the UN, the head of EPA, tell them that we want to restore the climate, because it's a whole new idea. The thinking on climate started 50 years ago. I was an undergraduate at MIT, and people said, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. Now, back then, the seasons were normal, the sea level rise hadn't started, and or the significant stuff we have now, and the goal was to get to zero emissions. In 1975, that was the perfect solution. By 1988, CO2 levels had gotten above the level that scientists say that we could survive. But no one had taken the gumption to say, "Oh, we need to change our goal." Well, it's very clear now that we need to change our goal. And so people can encourage our leaders to say, we want to restore a proven safe climate with CO2 below 300.
Wow. Well, two people I know, I'm not going to mention their name here, but two people I know for oceans and actually land. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's this argument about planting trees, planting trees, planting trees, planting so many trees. And you were the person that I loved that shared this with me, that a lot of people don't know this. It's great to plant trees, but I remember you telling me that as a tree gets older, you tell me if I'm wrong, Peter, as a tree gets older, I think you shared with me, it takes oxygen out of the air. Didn't you tell me that, something like that?
Well, sort of the obvious thing is when trees eventually die, and they either burn or they rot. Either way, the carbon goes right back into the atmosphere.
Yes.
It's not a well kept secret, and so
But,
um,
but as much as you think, people do not know that, Peter.
mm,
Because I love biology and I love science and I love soil science especially. Okay. And, the health of the soil, the health of the tree and the growth and everything. But I had never known that until you shared it.
oh, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you forget those things as you get older and you're not in school learning the way that you did before, you know?
Right,
So
right.
if that happens, if if it puts more carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, okay,
Mhm.
does planting another tree erase, create substitute for that?
Yeah, yeah. The thing to keep in mind is planting trees is very good for lots of reasons. I've got a persimmon tree out back here, and I like the persimmons. And of course, the tree absorbs CO2. The thing to remember, though, is our goal is the flourishing of humanity. We want to leave a planet that our future generations can live on. Pretty straight and simple, and that means getting CO2 to levels that humans have survived in the past. Now, the way nature has removed that trillion tons of excess CO2 10 times in the last million years. So we've had 10 ice ages, and before each ice age, the nature has pulled out that trillion tons of CO2 that we have excess right now and stored it. And then after the ice age, the nature puts that CO2 back into the air. And then if you think about it, where can nature put that much CO2? It's not on land. If it were to put that on land, that would double the amount of carbon on the land, which is possible, but that would obviously tremendously impact the environment. And how would you get the carbon back out again after the ice age? So it's in the ocean. The nature stores the carbon in the ocean, and the way it does it is with the phytoplankton, with iron, which turns the water green, which produces fish, and all the dead fish and phytoplankton fall to the bottom, and their feces fall. And when you get deep enough, there's not enough oxygen, and they just stay there for thousands of years. Then at the end of the ice age, the ocean currents change, and it starts oxidizing that stored carbon, and it turns back into carbon dioxide, warming the planet back up again. My point is that a lot of us really respect nature and think that the smartest thing to do is to use nature's methods as much as we can. If those work, that's great. If those don't work, then do something else. And so nature doesn't use trees to store carbon. Trees burn and they rot. And nature uses the ocean to store carbon. And that's what I recommend, both the limestone and the biocarbon from phytoplankton.
Yeah, that's very wow. If we sit here, Peter, and talk about some of the ways that people could restore the planet, okay? Because governments can only do what governments can do, okay?
Yeah.
But I love the we the people concept, but that even has to be balanced out because sometimes people go overboard. They go to the extremes. And that's why I've always liked the way you put things because it was it was a balanced way to look at things and deal with things. And you had places to choose from. Okay.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that we as human beings can do to restore the climate? Where we may not have the scientific degrees or whatever, but in everyday homes, families, communities, and so forth, what are the specific measurable actions that people can take ongoingly to restore this planet that would actually make a difference?
That's a great question. There, what I've seen is there are really two key things. First, I mentioned, which is tell our leaders that we want to restore the climate, because the reason, if you read the UN reports on climate, they don't mention the limestone. They don't mention the phytoplankton. They just don't mention them at all because no one ever asked the UN, how do we restore the climate? Those are solutions for restoring the climate. And it needs the people to tell our leaders, that's our goal now. We love that we're pushing zero emissions. We're on our way to zero emissions. But that zero emissions won't save our children and our grandchildren. So first thing is tell our leaders we want to restore the climate. Make sure Biden talks about it in the new administration. Make sure the EPA is talking about it. They want to talk about it. It's sort of like a conspiracy. Everyone that I talk to is afraid that the reason that no one else is talking, that obviously we want to restore the climate, there must be a good reason that we're not talking about it. And I don't want to be embarrassed to talk about something that there's a really obvious reason not to do. It's sort of like, when I was 3 and walked downstairs naked. I didn't realize there was a reason not to walk downstairs naked. But you can yes, our just like a parent can tell their kids, here's the rule. We need to tell our leaders the rule is restore the climate. The second thing is a little bit surprising, and that is if you look is small families. That if currently globally the average family size is 2 to 3 children per woman or per family. But they say per woman, obviously, and so it's 2.45 children, and if we and that's been going down. That's half what it was about 50 years ago, and if we bring it down from 2.5 to 1.5 to 1 or 2 children on average, and have that be the norm, that's just people expect that young families will have 1 or 2 children, maybe none, maybe 5, but 1 or 2 is the norm. Then that actually would bring the global population down to the point where we won't be using up the resources, because the CO2 emissions are a direct correlation to the number of people, as you would think, right? If you have twice as many people, they'll be producing twice as much emissions. And so having fewer people is very useful.
Al Gore said the same thing, right? And everyone wanted to accuse him of killing off the population. Interesting. No, it was going on for so long, and he said exactly what you said. I want people to get. Peter's not telling you or dictating to you what to do. He's saying that for us to restore the climate, and you tell me if I'm wrong, Peter, but this is what I'm getting. For us to restore the climate, we've got to be mindful that the more population increases, okay, the more gets the likelihood of us being able to restore the climate in a way that would be powerfully impacted in the time that we need to do so, because our population would be increasing at rapid speeds, as opposed to if we came down to the average 1 or 2 children per couple.
Yeah. Here's an interesting fact I just discovered about 2 months ago, that the global population now, how many more people do you think there are now than before the Industrial Revolution? 10 times. There's 10 times more people on our planet. And the population of the planet was just steady. It was going up every year by 0.004% every year for 10,000 or 100,000 years. And then it was going up 3%, 1,000 times faster. And we broke the feedback mechanism. Nature had figured out that, and for all animals and most plants, that you produce lots of eggs, lots of little fish, lots of seedlings, and then the environment will determine how many of those succeed to maturity. And that's why humans, even though we would have typically 4 or 5 children per woman, it was reliably 2 of them would survive to maturity, because young people are very susceptible. And of course, it breaks our heart when people die. And so we've added lots of medicine and health so young people don't die anymore. But that broke the feedback mechanism that nature developed over billions of years that kept our population in balance with the capacity of nature. And so that's why we have 10 times more people than we did 200 years ago. Is this 10 times more people sustainable? Probably not. I mean, I can't imagine how, if a system that was stable at one level, how it could be stable with 10 times more people living the way we live today. So what we say is small families are good for the climate.
Yeah. But now, I just, before you go, because we only have 2 minutes left, I want to ask you something, Peter. Like that, I understand what you said about the government and what we can do with that. But what, like, let's go in a little deeper, a lot more simplistic. What, if you had a group of people, what could every person do that can really jumpstart the restoration of the climate? I mean, the
Mm.
restoration of climate, period, and our oceans and our land.
Yeah. Um, well, really, there's two things. As I said, the fundamental things are tell our leaders that we want restoration. Second is encourage young people to have small families. But then the other thing is that there are lots of sort of almost gestures that we do, which really make a difference. So, for example, I put my daughter encouraged me to get solar panels 11 years ago, and I rolled my eyes. I had no particular interest in the climate at the time. I said, fine, it can't hurt. Um, and so I did, and then here I am developing the whole field of climate restoration. And my point is that those gestures make a difference. So recycling, putting solar panels on, get an electric car as soon as you can. I bought a electric car charger for my house 6 years ago, and still haven't bought an electric car because I don't drive very much. But obviously, I'm waiting to get my first electric car. And my son has a car, so he charges it when he gets here. But my point is, like getting a electric car charger in my driveway was a gesture. It didn't change anything, but it changed our actions. It helped my son decide to get an electric car because he knew when he came to visit, he could charge it. So all those gestures that people suggest, planting a tree, growing your own vegetables, being vegan, all those things are great to do. And it's great to acknowledge that they're gestures because they change your behavior unconsciously. And that's what's going to make a big difference.
Wow. Wow. Well, Peter, we are always happy to have you. This is very special because it's going out with our partners, which are David, Sherry, and Mesfin. They call themselves the Three Peacemakers, and they're amazing. And part of something called COM 26B, and we have the Boston Green Fest, Climate Hacks, We the World, and just so many other groups that have come together today. Caroline Schwab, Miranda Clendenning, which I think you know, and David Gershon and people of that nature who we've all come together, including myself with the Creators 2030 group, to see how we can put a blueprint for the future, for the restoration of climate. So I do look forward to talking with you more about that and what we talked about in the past with the Creators 2030 as well. And I just thank you for making the time to come on for people to understand ways in which they can make a difference, because it
Yeah.
means a lot. And from a balanced way of looking at things, not going to the extreme on one end and not going to the extreme on the other end. So it's always very powerful. So if you would just stay with us in the background in the green room for a moment
Mm-hmm.
while we end the broadcast, everyone, thank you for being with us. I see that many of you were with us, and we thank you for that. So just stay with us for one moment, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions.